All right, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Crush Common Cybersecurity Threats with Privileged Access Management, with guest speaker Rob Black, founder and managing principal of Fractional CISO. You're also joined by Beyond Trust product manager Martin Kennard, who will run us through a brief overview and demo of PowerBroker Password Safe after Rob's portion, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console. Anytime throughout the webinar, I will be monitoring those, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. You will also be able to find the slides in the handout section right now, so you can download them immediately. I have a couple of shout outs I'd like to get in before we start the webinar. A big welcome to those of you who were invited by our partner Simio. Simio is a global leader in identity as a service and deploys and manages the suite of Beyond Trust PAM solutions. Simio's identity services are powered by the industry's first IAM virtualization platform delivered via Simio's Identity Intelligence Center. Pretty cool stuff, guys. To see the full range of Simio identity services, please visit simiosolutions.com. Thanks so much for joining, and happy to have you guys here today. I also have Paul Roberts on the line, who is founder and editor-in-chief of Security Ledger, who helped make today's webinar training possible. So at this point, I'd actually like to welcome Paul to the line, who is going to give a brief introduction and then welcome our expert, Rob, to begin the training. So Paul, welcome and hello.
Hey, Sarah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. On the webinar, I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who signed on and is joining us this afternoon. Just wanted to take 2 minutes and tell you a little bit about Security Ledger. We are a cybersecurity news and information website based in the U.S., and we cover the full range of cybersecurity news and analysis. So everything with a focus on Internet of Things, critical infrastructure, healthcare, cybersecurity policy. We've got a blog, obviously securityledger.com, and a podcast. We do in-person and online events. So if you are interested, go to securityledger.com, subscribe, and you can sign up for one of our daily or weekly email newsletters. You can also just text the word security on your mobile phone to 345-345, and you can sign up that way as well. Okay, next slide. So just before we get going with Rob, I'd like to sort of give the Security Ledger perspective on the current threat landscape and just give you a sense of what's going on out there. One of the clear trends that we're seeing is that sophisticated targeted attacks are becoming the norm rather than the exception. So back in the day when we had things like the I love you virus or the SQL Slammer virus, adversaries were indiscriminate and obvious. When you got hit with a virus, you knew it. These days, you have a much wider range of adversaries, cyber criminals, nation-state actors, could be competitors conducting corporate espionage, disgruntled or former employees, and Rob's going to talk about that. And they could be after a wide range of things, from intellectual property to data for theft or ransom. They could be interested merely in taking you out of business, and we've seen destructive attacks like the NotPetya and WannaCry attacks earlier, or rather later last year. And so those are things that you really need to be worried about as an organization. Traditional perimeter-based defenses, as we all know, are no longer sufficient. And so what Rob's really going to talk about today, and it's worth listening to, is how to really harden the inside of your network, how to prevent the types of credential theft and account takeovers that allow sophisticated adversaries not just to breach your defenses, but also move laterally from low-value assets to higher-value assets within your organization. Those are things we write about and cover all the time at Security Ledger. So again, I'm happy to pass the baton over to Mr. Rob Black of Fractional CISO, who's got a great presentation. He's going to talk in more detail just about how some of these attacks play out and what you can do about them. So Rob Black, take it away.
Great, thanks Paul, and thanks to you at the team at the Security Ledger, and of course thanks to Sarah and the Beyond Trust team as well. Really appreciate being able to speak in front of you all today. Just going to talk about what I do on a day-to-day basis for a minute or less than a minute, and then bring that in the context on today's topic, which is crush common cybersecurity threats with privileged access management. At Fractional CISO, we help organizations with their cybersecurity leadership. So we help them quantify and assess risks and then build plans to mitigate those risks. So today, the goal of our presentation is for you to walk away with tools to sell privileged access management to your senior management team. And we're going to arm you with stories, a light threat model, quantifiable risks, and talk a little bit about return on investment, specifically with an example which hopefully you can apply to your environment. With that, let's begin. So first, we're going to spend a little time setting the stage. We're going to go over a number of disgruntled ex-employee stories, and why is that? Well, they lead to an obvious privilege issue. It's more difficult to deprovision users than we think, and so that's something we'll spend a little bit of time on. Next, we're going to talk about an area that I have a significant background, which is IoT security. We face the same issues as IT security, but on a larger scale of systems to secure. Then we're going to talk about quantifying IT cybersecurity risk. We're going to use numbers to back up our assertions, but don't worry, while there is math, we will not give you a test afterward. Finally, we're going to bring it home with an ROI calculation, so that's return on investment for one of the scenarios. All right, so let's harken back to August 2016 when Juan Rodriguez was fired from Marriott International. And just like most ex-employees, a few weeks later, he decided to get his revenge. I'm kidding with most ex-employees, but certainly something we should think about. And when people logged onto the Marriott website, they found rooms that would normally be in the hundreds of dollars down to $12 to $59 in range. And this was for over 3,000 rooms. And people booked thousands and thousands of dollars worth of hotel rooms for much less. This actually cost Marriott $50,000 in reduced rate charges. And how did it happen? Well, Juan Rodriguez decided he was going to be the Robin Hood of hotels and log into the reservation system and change the rates. Of course, Marriott cleverly did not change the passwords that Rodriguez had access to. And this is really a story that's typical of someone with privileges being fired and then taking action against his former employer. The consequences here, I would say, were relatively light. Marriott's a big company, $50,000 in charges, plus the expense of kind of the cleanup and then the embarrassment. Not great, but that can be handled. But of course, the consequences could have been much, much more severe. So anecdotes like the Robin Hood of Marriott are fun ones to talk about, but these types of methods, are these the types of methods of attacks that we should worry about? And in a recent Verizon data breach investigation report, they found that 81% of hacking-related breaches leveraged stolen and/or weak passwords. So obtaining credentials acts as a force multiplier to an attack. Being able to secure the accounts is paramount to reducing an organization's attack surface. We have some other fun stats. So according to Ovum market research, 11% of employees share passwords with coworkers. So in many cases, this may be for legitimate purposes. Maybe it's easier to accomplish the job instead of requesting another user account or figuring out why another user doesn't have permissions to see a particular file or piece of data. It's really scary though. This means that after a user departs from an organization, they may have valid credentials for a long time. So even worse than the internal employee have access, 5% of employees share credentials with an outside party. And I've seen this firsthand as a consultant. One of my clients recently offered me their password to access some data that I needed. I turned down the suggestion as it would open me up to liability if anything bad should happen, but it's also a really bad security practice. And I wonder, for all those on the webinar, does this happen in your organization? So now these stats blew me away. 34% of former employees access materials after leaving a company. That's 34%, that's basically a third of former employees. And according to this study with the Intermedia Data Vulnerability Report, almost half of IT workers do it as well. So if you don't have a great deprovisioning process for departing employees, there undoubtedly could be unfortunate incidents. Last week I was auditing a client's access for the production servers, and we found a user that no longer worked for the company that still had access to their mission-critical system. In general, I'll just say yikes. All right, so what can we do about it? So many are going to look to the latest high-tech security tools that this time are going to fix security for the organization. And that's why large organizations can have 50 different security solutions for their environment, and it's still compromisable. Advanced technology can help, but the key to successful outcomes can be much more basic. Instead of the latest gadget, we across the industry need to make sure that we scrub in to help secure our organizations. Like any surgery, which is only successful if the patient doesn't get an infection, we need to make sure that we are doing the most basic of things. In medicine, it's washing your hands. With security, it is having good process and systems around credentials and the privileges associated with those credentials. We need to make sure that we do the most basic of things. In medicine, there are sinks, soap, scrub brushes, procedures, and measurements for hand washing. In your organization, who is looking at the management of credentials and the activities that they authorize? Having a privileged access management solution is like having a scrub room next to the operating room. Doctors need to know the procedure, but they also need the tools to be successful. Moving on, now Marriott is not the only company with a disgruntled ex-employee. Now let's walk through a case of another high-profile company and its ex-employee. Gucci, the fashion brand, had an ex-employee essentially shut down operations for a day, resulting in lost revenue and lost productivity. While an employee there, he created a fake user profile and token to access the VPN. After termination, he tricked the staff into activating the account. What did he do? He surveyed the network for 5 months. He deleted virtual servers, took the storage area network offline, and deleted mailboxes from the corporate email server. Basically, he caused mayhem in the organization. Now, how did he do it? So first, you've got to give him credit for planning, although not the kind of planning most employers want to see in their employees. He added a fake VPN user and token. Then after he left, he tricked the staff into activating it. And of course, they cleverly didn't change the admin passwords for the 5 months after he was fired. So that is certainly not a best practice. When so many things go wrong, it's easy to blame a single point of failure, but the reality is that many controls could have saved the day or at least mitigated the scope of the attack. So on the administrative control side, they needed better checks when authorizing a token, like checking the employee database to make sure that it was an actual employee making the request. They needed to periodically audit who could access the VPN. When you see old users or users that don't belong in the first place, disabling the users could have made a huge difference. As we talked about earlier, 49% of IT staff access resources after departure. Changing system passwords after departure is probably the biggest thing that one could do to mitigate these type of attacks. From the technical controls perspective, monitoring the network and using machine learning to detect unusual patterns could help to mitigate this attack when it was in progress. And just one note, at the time of this specific incident, machine learning tools were much less developed than they are today. And then you can probably guess, being in a session covering privileged access management, so you can guess this last control. Imagine if the system passwords were in a privileged access management system. Once the admin departed and then they were turned off in the system, they would not have privileged access to any of the critical components in the network. Most successful attacks rely in part on weak credentials. I couldn't find a good quote here. Paul brought up the term force multiplier, which I really like, so I tweeted out and then screenshotted it to make a good slide. And one of the reasons is because I really like the term force multiplier for credentials. For this particular attack, there was a malicious insider who set up the token, social engineering, where they contacted tech support to get the token activated. There were bad processes all around. And all of that would have failed, so all of those things would have failed the attacker if the user was not able to get the administrative passwords to the network and systems. The compromised credentials were a force multiplier that had disastrous consequences for the organization. Now let's switch to an area where I have significant experience. Internet of Things, or IoT, connects devices together in a system. Just like any system, the credentials and privileges associated with the devices drive the security of the system. When credentials are compromised, that can lead to a lot of bad things happening. Thinking about all the devices that are connected in your life, I can imagine that the consequences could be severe. The term I use is IoT-geddon. That's when someone attacks a system or systems of devices for disastrous consequences. You can think of all the devices that drive life and safety issues. We don't want IoT-geddon to happen, and that's why protecting credentials and what privileged actions the devices can perform is very important. And so let's illustrate with a real-world example. Here we have a water meter used to measure the water intake into a home. So your municipality likely measures the water used by you on a monthly or quarterly basis and sends you a bill. There are a variety of ways to check the meter for billing. Some involve a human physically inspecting the meter. Others include devices to collect the data by walkers or drivers by the meter. A recent trend has been smart meters, where the meter sends an RF signal, so a radio frequency signal, to the base station to communicate the water usage for a given home. And we can see that architecture right here. So we're going to take a look at that. On the left side, we have the smart meter, which is communicating via radio frequency signal to the base station. The base station's at a fixed location, like at a cell tower or communications tower. Obviously needs to be in the vicinity to receive the RF signal. It in turn communicates the water usage to the data center, where they can use the information to prepare bills for the citizens. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk specifically about this attack. Last year, a man was sent to jail for hacking smart meters. So he logged in the base station and made changes that disabled the system for 5 different municipalities. This is 5 different cities and across 3 different states. And you can imagine the panic when an organization went to send out their bills and they found there was no data for the bills. So the attacker, of course, was a former employee of the smart meter company. He did the installations for the meters. When they fired him, they did not remove his access to the base station. Seems to be a common theme in this webinar. He simply telnetted from his home computer, used the same password that he always did, and made changes to the base station. So we can see the attacker here, and obviously he's an attacker because he's got a hoodie. He's telnetting into the base station and making communication changes to the smart meters. So some of the things that he did, across the different attacks, he changed the frequency on which they operated. He changed legitimate code to a Pink Floyd song. He changed at least one password. Okay, so in all these cases, the smart meters could not communicate with the base station. Now, this does not reflect well on his former employer because he did this to 5 different customers over several months. And, you might think that this guy earned his hacking hoodie, but of course, he did it from his home computer. He didn't mask his IP address. So maybe he's not exactly a master hacker. But now he's in prison serving over a 1-year sentence for his crimes. Here are the details for the attack that we just talked about. It's difficult to believe that the company did not change the passwords after firing an employee with access to the base station. This is a case where the hack actually disrupted operations of the company's customers, right? So they couldn't send out their bills. It certainly was very disruptive. Now, the provider did, a bunch of things that, probably were not ideal. One is they had internet accessible critical infrastructure with telnet support. So not a good idea. So basically, anyone with a password and the IP address of those devices could get in and make changes to the base station. They left the credentials unchanged after firing the employee, and so those 2 things together really lead to a total disaster. So, just a FYI for anyone from an IoT perspective, you should not have critical infrastructure directly internet accessible, and obviously should periodically change the credentials. Now let's generalize our learnings from this case. In this water meter example, it's really typical of some of the challenges with manning IoT systems. Every IoT device must have credentials. Managing those credentials is difficult. And fortunately, most IoT projects don't end up with an unfavorable headline, so that is a good thing. But there's a lot of commonality in successful attacks and maybe incidents that where attack didn't happen, but maybe they're following some of the same practices. Managing how credentials are provisioned is another challenge. With many architectures, the installer knows the credentials for the device. That means that they are a risk. Additionally, many implementations shortcut good key management practices and use default credentials or share credentials between devices. And when anyone who knows the credential scheme leaves the organization, there's a significant risk to the organization and society. As we learned, almost half of IT folks in some way access data from their past employer. Ensuring strong credentials for administrative accounts is paramount for IoT security. And we can imagine based, instead of smart meters, these were water filtration systems or other infrastructure that had a safety mechanism to them. And then the installer turned them off to allow contaminants into the water supply. Right? The IoT operator must do a good job of managing credentials or they could result in the loss of life or injury. And, based on my experience, there are a large number of vendors who struggle to manage the credentials on their IoT systems. This leaves society at large vulnerable to attacks by malicious parties. Let's hope that the industry catches up before a catastrophic incident occurs. And, my hopeful one contribution to society is this webinar to help remind us about managing our credentials for IoT systems. So while the consequences for not securing critical infrastructure might be different, these challenges with credentials and privileges are not specific to IoT. We're going to walk through an IT scenario on how we can quantify cybersecurity risk. Imagine that your role is to protect an application with a database. So the system has important records. They might be personal identifiable information, they might be medical records, they might be financial records. We always need to remember when we are protecting such a system that the records are usually not just in the production database, but in backups and test and development databases. Assuming you follow good security processes around the records, such as encrypting them, there's still a variety of ways to reduce your risk in the organization. So for instance, you could delete records that you no longer need. You could perform data masking on records in your test and development databases. So for instance, masking social security numbers or other key pieces of information. And of course, you can reduce the number of users who have access to the records and reduce the privileges for the number of records that they have access to. For this scenario, we could be a SaaS vendor providing data processing services to our customers. In our environment, we have a system. We have system administrators, we have tech support personnel, we have developers, we have contractors, and hopefully not, but possibly former employees. One thing you may ask is which of these have access to your mission critical production records? We don't have to be a SaaS vendor though. We could be a hospital, an education institution, or a financial institution, or really many other folks who have a database. It doesn't really matter much. Many of the attack vectors are really the same. Again, we have a similar list of people who can log into the database. In this scenario, potentially vendors might have an operational role in the data and have access into our data center. I was an interim CISO for an educational institution relatively recently, so I know some of these challenges firsthand. When you're responsible for thousands of student and medical records, you want to make sure that you reduce the attack surface. One of the areas of focus that I had was removing access to the records by staff that did not absolutely require access for their job. Now let's think through our risk calculations. We want to measure the impact and likelihood of something bad happening to our system. So risk equals the impact measured in dollars times the likelihood measured in probability. Now you may be used to doing this measurement with high, medium, and low, and I have yet to find a consistent metric for what high means. Also, if we think about our job, and our job, let's say, is to get funding for a privileged access management project, and we're going to need senior management to get buy-in there. Senior management typically thinks in terms of dollars. So if we believe that there's a risk to our organization that a PAM project or other technologies could help to solve, we owe it to them to estimate the cost to our organization using the language of business. Fortunately for the asset side of the equation, it's relatively easy to come up with impacts. The Ponemon Institute has a great study looking at the cost of data breaches. We will take the average value from the study, which is $141 per record, and multiply it times the number of records that we have. So in this scenario, we might have 10,000 records, 100,000 records, 1 million records. You can just fill in the blank for whatever your answer is. We can use these to come up with the impact of a breach of our database application. There's no magic with these numbers. If you, for instance, had contractual penalties, you could substitute those values for these. So there's no magic here. But you also want to remember to add in the cost of managing the breach, restoring systems, and potential brand damage. That stuff's not free. That's why I like to use the Ponemon numbers, because it aggregates all the data together. In this scenario, we're just concerned about the data being breached. So in other situations, we might be concerned with loss of life or safety. And here are some numbers to think about. We're going to ignore the numbers for this instance. But if you do have a life safety responsibility, you should probably plan for costs in the millions for a human life. It might be horrible to think in those terms. A large impact number will discourage bad behavior in your organization for low probability but high consequence events. So if we look at, for instance, what the U.S. government does in terms of planning for, if you're the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or the Department of Transportation, you're somewhere in the $8, $9, $10 million range in terms of what the planning number is for the cost of life. And if we do a similar thing, that's going to discourage bad behavior on our part, where maybe, even though it's low likelihood, obviously the consequence can be horrible, and never mind the monetary cost. Just think about if you were responsible, how this would affect you, never mind the person who's dead and their family. All right, so let's get back to the exercise at hand and we'll just work on likelihood. So we're going to ignore life safety for the rest of this exercise. So next is the likelihood calculation. This is where organizations have trouble quantifying the likelihood of an unlikely event such as a breach. Okay, so there are many tricks for doing the calculations, and their entire methodologies such as FAIR, or factor analysis of information risk. So those have been developed to compute the likelihood. And that's not really the goal of this webinar. So we're going to shortchange the calculation with some historic interpolation. So Vivo Security made a really nice calculation based on past breaches that a 10,000 employee organization will have 0.15 breaches annually. And we'll use this number for 1,000, 5,000, or 10,000 employee organizations for the purpose of the webinar. So, for you on the phone, if you're, those size organizations, we'll just plug in those numbers. Now, I'm going to give you some words of caution here. So for more precision, one should measure their specific environment, that includes the industry they are in and the controls in place to mitigate threats. A risk with the methodology we're going to use here for the webinar purposes is that small organizations with valuable data might think that they're a little threat. But of course, averages are a terrible thing to use when the bad guys know where the important information is. And so they may target you even if you're a smaller organization. Or they could have automated software to find some vulnerability in your network, your systems, that they know they can exploit. So let's not find comfort with the numbers used, but again, here we'll just to kind of illustrate a point. So for 5,000 employees, we're going to divide the number by 2. So we had 10,000 employees is 0.15. So for 5,000 employees, to come up with the breaches per year, we expect, for an organization that size to have 0.075 breaches per year. So that's a pretty small number, and you would think intuitively that makes sense given that everyone's not breached all the time, but that doesn't mean never. So now we're going to now that we know the impact based on the number of records, and we know the likelihood based on the number of employees, we're going to multiply the two values together to get our expected annual loss due to breach. Okay, so this is our annual cost calculation. So you can see the top the top row has the number of records, the column on the left has the number of employees. We multiply the two values that we got together to come up with the monetary number. And if you look at, for instance, 1,000 employees and 100,000 records, we come up with $211,500. So, how's this going to manifest itself? It's not, you're not going to have a tiny breach every year of $211,000. What's going to happen is, 1 year you're going to have $0, next year you'll have $0, next year you'll have $0, and then 1 year there'll be a huge loss, right? So a huge loss. And so that's the way things go with cybersecurity. What this does tell us, however, is how much we should be willing to invest per year to mitigate additional risk to our organization. And again, let's remember we did a little webinar math here to do a shortcut. So we should use a more representative number that represents our organization and not just the sample organization. All right, so now let's figure out the return on investment. So we just quantified the risk, and we're going to figure out the return on investment for a privileged access management project. Okay, so we're going to stick with the same scenario, right? So we're assuming $212,000 of annual risk. We know from earlier in the webinar that 81% of hacking breaches leverage stolen or weak passwords. Now let's add in a few additional assumptions. One is that 50% of password risk can be reduced with PAM. I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. It probably is pretty conservative. We're going to make another conservative assumption, and that is PAM has all sorts of other benefits. We're just going to ignore those for this exercise, right? So those are the things that can deliver value. We just ignore it. So now remember, we're a 1,000-person company with 100,000 records. We're assuming away the other risks. This result indicates, that we could basically do the calculation by taking $212,000 times 81% times 50% equals $86,000 of annual risk can be mitigated with PAM. So therefore, PAM could be a terrific investment. We could likely make back our cost of implementation in year one, and every subsequent year would be a net benefit to our organization. Obviously there's some maintenance and management of that, but certainly that's a fair amount of dollars to work with to reduce that risk. And so with some relatively simple math, we can demonstrate to senior management that this is a worthwhile investment. So now, how do we get budget for a privileged access management project? Handling an organization's privileged accounts is one of the top vulnerabilities in any organization's security posture. So first, we can demonstrate a problem. Some examples might be, in a recent audit of our servers, we found 3 users with accounts who no longer work here. We haven't changed our admin password since Frank left last month, or maybe something like, all of our developers have access to all of our production systems. Some organizations might not require a business case, as some of these scenarios are quite compelling that they need to be fixed, but anecdotes might not be sufficient for other organizations. So for these scenarios, we want to quantify the risk. What assets are we protecting? What are the paths for a successful attack? What's the likelihood of a successful attack? Just quantifying the assets we're protecting is a great first step in understanding our organization's required security posture. Creating a risk model helps to drive discussion around investment. So even if senior management disagrees with the assumptions that are made, it's a great opportunity to ask, the person who's disagreeing said, well, what value would you select? And this can really drive a great discussion and organizational buy-in for the values that are selected. So I'd like to leave you with the key statistics that we reviewed at the beginning of the presentation. 81% of hacking-related breaches leverage either stolen and/or weak passwords. 11% of employees share passwords with coworkers, and 5% share them with an outside party. 34% of former employees access materials after leaving a company. 49% of IT workers do it. Don't think that your organization is different. You need to find ways to mitigate these risks to help secure your organization. Now, what are the next steps? I'm going to turn things over to Martin to talk about Beyond Trust Power Broker in a minute. First, if you need help quantifying your cybersecurity risk, building a business case for privileged access management or other tools, or for help putting a plan in place to mitigate your organizational risk, then please contact us. Our contact details are below. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be back with you in a few minutes to answer your questions. Now I'll turn it over to Martin. Martin.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Rob. All right, let me just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. And by the way, if you can't, then hopefully somebody will shout out and say, no, we can't see a screen.
We can see it,
So,
Martin. If you could go into full presentation mode, that'd be great. Oh, yep, there you go. Got it.
There you go, way ahead of you, sister. All right, so what we're going to do is talk about how password safe can really sort of mitigate a lot of these threats, because you know, I mean, let's face it. I mean, part of the issue really is the fact that, you know, a lot of administrators are put into positions where they have access to credentials, and oftentimes it's not just a system they have access to legitimately. It's, you know, where are all the other systems? I mean, how are they going to sort of potentially traverse laterally, you know, if they want to do something malicious? We also have to consider, you know, what people potentially do when, you know, that they're all, you know, if something is done accidentally, because obviously, you know, with a privileged set of credentials, performing, you know, specific operations will obviously have a bigger impact, you know, if you don't have access to those sensitive areas. So essentially what password safe is as you'd expect. I mean, the name on the tin is password management, you know, so it's all around rotating credentials, making sure that everything is, you know, done according to policy. We can scan an environment, so we can tell you exactly this is what you have. So this is your, you know, current state of play with all your credentials. Here's the time that the password was last changed. You know, here was when it was last logged on to. You know, potentially we can even say, you know, I mean, is it expired? Is it an admin account? So there's a lot of metadata we can do just by scanning. You know, obviously making sure that things are rotated with policy is an important thing. But the other thing as well is it's not just passwords. You're really as strong as your weakest link. If you think of like an SSH world, you know, Unix, Linux, you know, SSH keys. A lot of admins use SSH keys because they're easy. You know, I mean, you basically set up a public key in a whole bunch of systems against a specific account, and then you use a private key in your script in order to be able to do batch updates. So, you know, invariably they're used. The problem becomes, though, is, you know, people tend to think, okay, great, I've got all my passwords managed, so I'm good. But then they forget about the fact that, okay, well, we also have these other areas. So it's all about, you know, when we look at security, it's a holistic approach. You know, so it's about giving people access to credentials when they need it. It's about, you know, obviously looking at credentials that are used for applications. So you might have service accounts used for services, you know, Windows services, for example, or even service accounts that are used by personnel for specific applications. Those are all things that need to be rotated. A2A, you know, we start looking at applications. There's a whole bunch of stuff, you know, I mean, I've seen things in the field where, you know, customers will hard code credentials into applications such that they actually have to recompile their application every time they change a password. You know, that's a really big issue, you know, and so A2A is a very important aspect. And again, like I say, you know, it's all about making sure that you're covered in every respect. Now, one of the things that I always say is, like, the best password management system is one where you never release a credential. And this is where session management comes into play, because this way, even if you're not worried about recording what a user does, you can give them access to the system they need to access without releasing any credentials. You can just log them in automatically. That's a really, really key feature. Now, you know, of course, if you want to be able to record it, then there's a whole bunch of things we can do. So we can record keystrokes, you know, standard in, standard out, full video recording. Everything is indexed. You know, everything that gets pasted into, for example, like any RDP session, we index anything that's in the paste buffer and allow you to be able to search for it across sessions. You can do real-time alerting, you know, based upon what a user's doing. We can even allow you to be able to view sessions as they're actually, you know, in progress. So you don't even have to wait for a session to finish before you can actually start, you know, searching and looking for the activity. We do real-time session monitoring, so you can look over somebody's shoulder, and actually see what they're doing. You can also interact, in terms of terminating the session. You can lock the session if you think there's something nefarious is happening. And then we also have, the ability to be able to do automated blocking and alerting when certain conditions happen. So as I say, it's really about that, so you need to cover every area because, otherwise you're going to leave a gap that could potentially be exploited. So when it comes to the session recording, it's, when, everything that we're capturing is all around ease of use because ultimately there's plenty of tools out there that will check the boxes. Password management to an extent has become a very commoditized market, and where the differentiators are ease of use and scalability. How easy is it to deploy? How well does it scale? And then also, more importantly, is how easy is it for your end users to be able to use a system? Because let's face it, if you put something in place and it's difficult for users to use, if they're playing like Twister on the keyboard every time they want to be able to, access a remote session, they're not going to use it. They're going to find workarounds. So you have to have something which is an enabling technology as well as a security technology. So in terms of playback, as you can see, it's just an example of a Windows session recording. SSH is exactly the same. Everything is indexed. You can search within the session. You can also search outside the session and actually pull down, for example, a list of sessions, that have certain keywords in them. We allow you to be able to export information for forensics, where they're all fully timestamped. And we also have the ability for admins to be able to go in and basically make comments. So you might have a reviewer role in your organization, and maybe there's some due diligence. System owners have to go in and just sort of check activity. We tend to see this a lot in sort of financial services. It's really very much like a SAS 70 requirement. And so what happens is you can go in, you can then say, yeah, okay, I've reviewed it, this is okay, and then ultimately you can prove to your auditors that you're not only capturing the recording, but you're actually doing something intelligent with them as well. So the other big thing as well, where we really differentiate is, about, adding contextual security, because there's a lot of products out there that will allow you to be able to, for example, say, yeah, you can log in from Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and here's a group of systems you have access to. But what about the context? What about somebody that, has a normal daytime job, but occasionally they got to cover fire call? What about somebody that's woken up in the middle of the night because they're the only person that can access a system because no one else is available? What about a person that suddenly has to travel? They're away from their corporate office. And so basically what we do is we allow you to be able to evaluate the day, the date, the time, where the person is. So we look at the IP address, where they're coming from, who they are, obviously, and what they're trying to do. So what this means is that you can now have something that says if you log in from an office during daylight hours, you can go in, there's no approval, everything's hunky-dory. If you log in during the middle of the night and you don't normally do this, then we're going to potentially allow for approval. We may change some of the access rules in terms of the scope of the accounts that you can access. Or indeed, if you think of like a remote vendor use case, you might have a vendor that normally comes from an IP address. If all of a sudden their credentials become compromised, you don't necessarily want their credentials to come in from anywhere other than where that remote vendor normally operates from. So again, adaptive workflow control, is really that very key aspect of controlling how the users access your, the system. Now I'm going to, I try not to be too slidey, so this is really the last slide I'm going to show you before I actually show you the product itself. I just want to point out that it's not just us blowing our trumpet. The analysts, actually do a lot of testing, and this isn't just, analysts that go out and say, yeah, okay, we looked at your marketing material and this is what you say you do, so we're okay. For example, in the Forrester Wave, they've actually just, did a 3-month evaluation on all of the products in the market, installed it, ran through an identical set of use cases, and graded every organization. So, to come out on top at that particular report was a very great accolade, because again, that's a very, very intensive stuff. So like I say, it's obviously something that we got a very good customer base, very referenceable, and also the analysts like us. So Anyway, so let's actually get onto the demo and show you exactly what I mean. So, like I say, there's a lot of products out there, that will drive you through a different process. So if I'm an administrator and I want to be able to access a system, typically I might have to log on to a web interface in order to be able to gain access. So what we've done is we've added something called Direct Connect. And Direct Connect means that I can forget about the web interface. I can go directly to my tool of choice. So let's say I want to open up an RDP session. I can actually go in here, let's say, I want to access, the CISSP 01 system, and I want the admin 01 account. So I got a shortcut here, which I just put in MOBA extern. So I can open this up, give it my Active Directory credentials. This is just my own personal credentials. And what's happening now is the proxy at the back end is going in, checking out the credentials, and it's basically going to connect me to a session. So you see here, now that's logging me in. So I'm actually logged in now as the admin 01 account. We'll see that the policy I've got on here is actually going to auto-log me off in 20 minutes time, so it's obviously making me aware of that as a user. But the cool thing is like everything that I'm doing here can be audited. So, for example, let's say administrators had a notification to say that somebody's logged into the system. They can then go to the admin interface and they can look at the active sessions. So we'll put up the active session. Again, we've got a thumbnail of exactly what's happening on the screen at the time. You can see, so that's everything that the user does. If I find this little one here, you see I'm moving around. Everything is actually captured. Now it's not only captured, but as you see, everything that the user does is also audited. So they left-clicked on this, they right-clicked on that, they open this window, they open this application. This is all searchable. So if you want to find all the users that were running a particular application, you can search for it right across, at the top. That will show you all the sessions where someone's run that application. Now, I'm actually looking at a live session. I can also do this actually on saved sessions, on the recording itself. But as you see, so it doesn't matter whether it's saved or whether it's live, I can do the same thing. Now, let's say, for example, something nefarious is happening, and I determine that, I actually just want to be able to stop the user from actually doing what they're doing, but I want to check. Now, with most systems out there, they have a terminate function, but it's very abrupt. What if they were doing something legitimate? I don't necessarily want to terminate it. So what you find is with a lot of tools is, security admins very rarely terminate sessions because of the risk of destroying something that's legitimate. So we've added something called a lock. So what this means is when I lock it, now what happens is you see I get a pop-up, on there. It's an overlay on top of the session. I can no longer interact with the session. I can't do anything with it. Now, it hasn't closed it. It's still running in the background. As you see, the countdown timer is still going. The clock is still be going, obviously when it sort of counts over. But the difference is I can no longer interact. Now, if everything's okay after investigation, they can unlock it, and then I can carry on, and I can do exactly what I was doing beforehand. So, as I say, that's effectively how we work with them. Now, the other thing that we can also do is we can do exactly the same thing, with SSH as well. So let's say, for example, I got a shortcut. I want to be able to log on to a Linux environment. So I'm basically going to put in my own AD credentials, and this is now actually going to connect me using that connection string onto the box. So if we do who am I, I'm actually logged in as admin 01. Again, same type of deal. If we actually look over here, if I refresh my sessions, we'll see that now I've actually got the SSH session that's here and everything that I'm doing. So, if I do every command I'm running, it is actually going to be coming out and echoed on there. Again, everything is indexed on what I'm doing. Locking also works. If I lock the session, we'll see here, this actually saying that it's been locked at the top. Obviously, I can unlock that as required. But that's the really key thing. So, it's, password management is one thing, but it's giving tools that enable your administrators to be able to operate more efficiently is the key to implementing a successful PAM solution. You want your users to be able to embrace it. You want them to be able to say, what, this actually makes my job easier. I don't have to worry about storing passwords, updating passwords. All I need is a set of shortcuts. I put it in my favorite tool, and I'm able to log on and use them. Now, obviously, we still have a web interface, use cases where that's important. So, users can go in, they can search for, anything that they have that's under their, under their belt. We have, very easy login capabilities. For example, there's like a one-click login. I can just go in and I can click it to be able to release it. But it's all around about having choice. You can have a web interface, but what we find is a lot of customers really like the direct connect because that gives you security without the pain, effectively. It allows you to be able to log in. So this is really, the core of what I want to show here. I'm not, I don't want to kind of labor the point on much of this stuff. So I think what would be good is to, really sort of go back and, open it up for some Q&A with Sarah and see if we've got any questions around what you've seen so far.
And you guys, I'm going to launch a second poll. You should see that pop up on your screen right now. And if you want a more thorough, personalized one-on-one demo with a Beyond Trust security expert, please select yes, and somebody will be in contact with you to schedule that one-on-one demo, or even just to have a deeper conversation about any of our PAM solutions or vulnerability management solutions, and we can really dive in a lot deeper with you on a personalized fashion. So I'm going to keep this poll up. We're going to jump into some Q&A. Rob, I had a couple of questions pop in for you during your portion, so let's go ahead and dive into those. How do you know if IoT product vendors are following good security practices like managing their credentials and privileges?
Yep. So good question. You don't. I think it's incumbent on us as consumers of IoT products to ask those questions of our vendors. Certainly, there are some cases where we can get good hints if we see strong security processes around a lot of things. For instance, I was evaluating a vendor the other day, and I saw they had a very well thought out bug bounty program. I don't know for a fact that they're managing their credentials well, but I would suspect that that's the case. I think in the case where we're procuring a big system, we certainly should ask that in our RFP, or basically make that as a condition of our of the contract, because obviously all the security they put in there, if they're not managing those privileges, security totally falls apart, and then suddenly you won't be able to get your reports for your water treatment system, or your water, the water flow.
Okay, second question. Rob, for IoT, can you use PAM to access the devices themselves?
Yeah, so another good question. So if you remember that diagram with the hacker with the hoodie and the telnet session, that was a telnet session, and vendors like Beyond Trust, for instance, can help protect telnets. So certainly in that case, there are many cases where IoT solutions are Linux operating systems. So basically anything that can protect a Linux operating system can do that. So for instance, like Beyond Trust. So there's lots of cases where PAM can do that. There's some cases where you have maybe more of an embedded device where that might not be possible. But so it really depends on your application. But certainly many cases that it would.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the things that we can do is, even if there aren't remote management capabilities for the credentials, you can manually store them, and then when users need to access them, we can launch, sort of fat clients, that will live on operating systems or web interfaces and play those credentials in automatically. So, what you're doing is you're guiding people down a specific administrative path. Where the credentials don't get released, and they have to come in through this one route in order to be able to access that system.
Martin, could you jump in and explain what the licensing model for Beyond Trust is?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's based upon what we call asset. So an asset is really a repository of accounts. So, if you have, it could be a database, could be an operating system, a hypervisor, anything that is sort of deemed a credential store is an asset. I mean, Active Directory is another good example of one asset. It's a store of credentials. So it's all based upon the number of assets.
Rob, another question for you. What if you can't cost justify a PAM project based on the risks an organization has?
Yep. So, so I think on one hand, if you legitimately can't cost justify it, then don't do it. I think many cases where you think one thing are, one, do you have a good understanding of your assets in your organization, what the value of those assets are? And then the second thing is, are you appropriately looking at your risks? Because if you're not managing your privileges, and you have something of value, then it would be hard to believe that you wouldn't be able to cost justify a PAM project. But if that's the case, maybe you have great process around privileges and you have very ethical people in your organization. I guess it's theoretically possible, but I would think you'd be in the very, very small minority. So probably just sharpening the pencil can help to cost justify engaging in a PAM project.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Paul, did you receive any questions coming in? I know you were monitoring those also. Okay, I'm going to assume no since it's silent. All right, guys. Actually, I did receive a couple of questions asking about the recording and the slides. So just a reminder that you will be receiving an email from communications@beyondtrust.com, and it will include a link to the slides and the recording. So you can refer back to them. You can send them to colleagues who weren't able to join, and that will be in your inbox 1 to 2 business days. Cool. So I think that that's pretty much it. I see another question come in from Andy to discuss two-factor authentication. Andy, is this question to Martin? Martin, is there anything that you can shed a little bit of light on to about two-factor authentication?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so we fully support two-factor, whether it's, for example, Radius, Smart Card, SAML 2.0. I mean, we fully support two-factor with a direct connect interface as well. Whether it's push, whether it's entering tokens. So yeah, regardless of UI, we support two-factor.
Okay, great. Paul, do you want to go ahead and jump on again? I think you said you had a couple of questions come in.
Yeah, Rob, I mean, I was really interested in your kind of use of the smart water meter as an example, and I guess I'd ask you for a little bit of guidance or insight as not just smart infrastructure, but more connected products are coming into enterprise environments. Maybe some wisdom or guidance on how to manage that influx in a way that allows you to keep control over them and oversight, and also, as you suggested, try and extend some security out to those connected devices as well. Kind of where you see things.
Yeah, so I think there's two kinds of connected products. So one is managed by an outside vendor. For instance, if you are, let's say, a hospital and you have a connected MRI machine or some other piece of medical equipment, it's incumbent on you as a hospital to make sure that your vendor is doing a really good job managing that device. That's obviously a very important piece of machinery, and anything bad that happens that could be catastrophic in nature. In the case where you're bringing something in, so let's say a camera or smart TV or any of those smart clocks, things for watering the lawn. I mean, there's like all sorts of smart infrastructure that comes into companies. You need to handle that just like you would if you're procuring a laptop or a desktop, right? There needs to be an enrollment process, there needs to be a management plan, and there needs to be, you need to have activity around it so you understand that device. It needs to be patched, obviously, and last but definitely not least is the credentials on that need to be managed in a very smart way. And if you're not using a privileged access management type solution or some way to manage those credentials, when system administrators leave or when you think they potentially have been compromised, you need to have a way to manage that. But in the case where you're managing the devices, you need to treat that like any other piece of IT infrastructure and have really good processes around it.
Okay, guys, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. It's the top of the hour. We need to jump off. A huge thanks to our experts and everybody who attended live today. Thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We will see you at the next one. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.
Great, thanks.